Colorado Territory, 1875. The spring winds whistled through the tall pines of Red Creek, carrying whispers of opportunity and danger in equal measure. In this untamed corner of the West, a man was measured by his grit, his gun, and his ability to survive alone against the elements. At least, that was what Jackson Caldwell had always believed. Jackson guided his chestnut gelding down the dusty main street of Red Creek, his lean frame relaxed in the saddle despite 20 hours of hard riding. At 25, he had already carved out a reputation as one of the most capable drovers in 3 territories, with a face handsome enough to turn heads in every saloon from Denver to Cheyenne. His square jaw held just enough stubble to suggest he had been on the trail, but not enough to hide the strong lines of his face. Beneath his wide-brimmed Stetson, clear blue eyes surveyed the town with the caution of a man who had learned early that attachment meant vulnerability. "Trust gets you killed out west," his father had told him before bleeding out from an Apache arrow when Jackson was just 13. It was a lesson reinforced by 8 years of driving cattle, watching companions fall to stampedes, rustlers, and the unforgiving elements. Jackson had built his life around a simple philosophy: rely on no one, protect what is yours, and never put down roots deep enough that they cannot be pulled up at the first sign of trouble. What he wanted was straightforward: save enough money to buy his own spread, run his own cattle, answer to no man but himself. What he told himself he did not need, could not afford in this harsh country, was the companionship that other men seemed so desperate for. A wife meant responsibility, children meant vulnerability. Both meant having something precious that could be taken from you, just as his mother and father had been taken from him. Jackson stepped down from his horse in front of the Red Creek General Store, stretching muscles stiff from the trail. The spring cattle drive had ended early this year, with good prices in Denver allowing him to pocket more than expected. He had supplies to buy before heading to the small cabin he kept in the foothills, a place to lay low until the next drive. The bell above the store's door jangled as he stepped inside, the familiar smell of coffee, leather, and dried goods greeting him. Old Man Harris nodded from behind the counter. "Caldwell, thought you might have gotten yourself killed this time," Harris said, his weathered face creasing in something close to a smile. "Not yet," Jackson replied, moving toward the shelves of canned goods, though not for lack of trying on the part of a few Sioux who took exception to our crossing. He gathered his supplies methodically: coffee, beans, salt pork, ammunition. The routine was familiar, comforting in its predictability, until it wasn't. The bell above the door rang again, and the store went silent in a way that made the hair on the back of Jackson's neck stand up. He turned slowly, hand instinctively drifting toward the Colt revolver at his hip. Instead of danger, he found beauty. She stood in the doorway, sunlight haloing around her slender frame. At 20 years old, Pearl Whitaker was like nothing Red Creek had ever seen, certainly nothing Jackson had ever seen. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, though a few wayward strands had escaped to frame a face of startling perfection. Her blue calico dress, while simple, accentuated a figure that made Jackson momentarily forget his own name. But it was her eyes that truly caught him, large, expressive, the color of summer storms. They moved across the room with intelligence and caution before settling on him, with an intensity that made him shift his weight uncomfortably. She moved toward the counter, steps light and graceful, and handed Harris a folded piece of paper. The storekeeper read it, eyebrows rising slightly. "Of course, Miss Whitaker. I'll have these items gathered for you directly." Jackson realized he was staring only when Harris cleared his throat pointedly. He turned back to the shelves, but his awareness remained fixed on the woman standing just feet away. Something about her seemed different from the saloon girls and farmers' daughters he occasionally encountered. There was a stillness to her, a self-contained quality that seemed at odds with her youth and beauty. When Harris began gathering her items, Jackson found himself speaking without intending to. New to Red Creek. The woman turned toward him, those storm-gray eyes meeting his directly. She nodded once but offered no verbal response. "Town's not much, but it's safer than most in these parts," he continued, unsure why he felt compelled to speak to her. Again, she simply nodded, a small smile softening her features. Harris returned with a box of supplies. Miss Whitaker arrived on yesterday's stage from Denver. She's staying with Widow Jenkins until her brother arrives next month. Miss Whitaker is, he hesitated, glancing at her as if for permission, unable to speak. Lost her voice to scarlet fever as a child, she tells me. Jackson felt a rush of embarrassment at his clumsy attempt at conversation, followed by an unexpected surge of interest. A beautiful young woman who couldn't speak, who couldn't argue, nag, or demand, seemed almost too convenient to be real. The thought made him ashamed almost as quickly as it had formed. He touched the brim of his hat. Jackson Caldwell, Miss Whitaker. If you need anything while you're waiting on your brother, Harris knows how to find me. The offer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Harris, whose bushy eyebrows nearly disappeared into his hairline. Jackson never offered assistance to strangers. The frontier had taught him that entanglement led to obligation, and obligation led to disappointment, or worse. Pearl inclined her head in acknowledgement, then reached into a small purse at her waist, withdrawing a pencil and a tiny notebook. She wrote quickly before turning the page toward him. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I appreciate the kindness of strangers in this new place." Her handwriting was neat and precise, much like her appearance. Jackson found himself fascinated by this silent communication. "Hardly a stranger now, Miss Whitaker. We've been properly introduced." The smile that came with his words felt rusty from disuse. She wrote again, her pencil moving swiftly. "Then I shall consider you my first acquaintance in Red Creek. Perhaps you might tell me more about this town since you know it well." It was a simple request, one he would normally refuse with a polite excuse about business elsewhere. Instead, he heard himself saying, "I'd be happy to show you around once you're settled." Harris coughed loudly, clearly stunned by this uncharacteristic behavior. Jackson ignored him, his attention fixed on Pearl's responsive smile, a genuine expression that reached her eyes and changed her entire face. As she gathered her purchases and headed toward the door, Jackson found himself watching her departure with an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, yet somehow the predictable routine of his carefully isolated life had been disrupted. It was not until she had gone that he realized the true danger of the situation. For the first time in years, Jackson Caldwell was intrigued by another human being. And in his experience, interest led to attachment, and attachment led to pain. He would be wise to ride out of town immediately and forget the silent beauty with storm-gray eyes. Instead, 3 hours later, Jackson found himself walking beside Pearl Whitaker through the dusty streets of Red Creek, pointing out landmarks and sharing the town's brief history. She listened attentively, occasionally writing questions or observations in her notebook. "The saloon looks rough," she wrote after they passed the Rusty Nail, where piano music and raucous laughter spilled into the street. "It is," Jackson confirmed. "Not a place for a lady. Red Creek's grown some, but it's still wild at its heart." Pearl's pencil moved across the page. "And what of you, Mr. Caldwell? Are you wild at heart as well?" The directness of her question startled him. Most young women of good breeding approached such matters more delicately. Then again, perhaps the inability to speak had taught her to be economical and straightforward with her written words. "I'm a drover, Miss Whitaker. I move cattle from ranches to railheads. It's not a life for the faint-hearted, but I wouldn't call it wild, just necessary." She studied him for a long moment before writing again. "You didn't answer my question. I asked about your heart, not your occupation." Jackson stopped walking, genuinely taken aback. "My heart isn't much of anyone's concern, including my own. Out here, survival matters more than sentiment." Pearl's expression became thoughtful as she wrote. "Perhaps that's why the West remains so untamed, too many hearts neglected in favor of survival." The observation struck him like a physical blow. Before he could formulate a response, a commotion erupted from the direction of the livery stable. Shouts and the sound of breaking wood drew their attention. "Stay here," Jackson instructed, instinctively moving between Pearl and the disturbance. He approached cautiously, hand resting on his revolver. The scene that greeted him was chaotic. A massive bay stallion had broken free of its handlers and was rearing dangerously, its powerful hooves threatening anyone who came close. The livery owner, a man named Dawson, was attempting to corner the animal with the help of two stable hands, but the horse was too frenzied, its eyes rolling white with fear. "Get back," Jackson called, assessing the situation quickly. A crowd was gathering, creating more noise and further agitating the animal. To his alarm, he felt someone brush past him, Pearl, ignoring his instruction to stay put. Before he could stop her, she had stepped into the open space between the onlookers and the frightened horse. "Miss Whitaker," Jackson lunged forward, but stopped short when he saw what was happening. Pearl had removed her bonnet and stood perfectly still, her honey-blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight. Her posture was relaxed, non-threatening. The stallion's ears flicked forward, its attention caught by this calm presence amid the chaos. With slow, deliberate movements, Pearl reached into her pocket and produced what appeared to be a piece of dried apple. She extended her hand, palm flat, and waited. The horse snorted, tossing its magnificent head. Everyone held their breath as the animal took one cautious step toward Pearl, then another. Jackson's hand remained on his revolver, ready to draw if the stallion charged. But incredibly, the horse approached Pearl with growing curiosity, finally stretching its neck to take the offered treat from her palm. As the animal chewed, Pearl gently raised her other hand and began stroking its muzzle. Within minutes, the dangerous situation had been diffused, the stallion now docile under her touch. Dawson approached carefully, lead rope in hand. "I'll be damned," he muttered as Pearl easily slipped the rope over the horse's head and handed it to him. "The beast nearly killed 2 men this morning." Pearl smiled modestly and retrieved her notebook from her pocket. He was frightened, not vicious. Sometimes what seems dangerous is merely misunderstood. She turned the page toward Jackson, whose expression had transformed from alarm to amazement. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed," he said, unable to keep the admiration from his voice. "Where did you learn to handle horses like that?" Pearl wrote quickly, "My father bred horses in Pennsylvania before he died. They speak without words as I do. Perhaps that's why we understand each other." Jackson stared at her, suddenly seeing beyond her beauty to something far more compelling, a courage and competence that belied her delicate appearance. In a land where survival depended on such qualities, Pearl Whitaker had just proven herself more capable than many men he'd ridden with. "I believe I've misjudged you, Miss Whitaker," he admitted as they continued their walk, the excitement of the moment gradually settling. "I thought you might find the frontier too harsh for your sensibilities." Her pencil flew across the paper. "Many people underestimate me because I cannot speak. I've grown accustomed to surprising them." Jackson found himself smiling genuinely. "Consider me thoroughly surprised and impressed." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jackson reluctantly acknowledged that their tour must end. He escorted Pearl back to Widow Jenkins' modest home on the edge of town. At the gate, Pearl wrote one final note. "Thank you for today, Mr. Caldwell. Would you be willing to show me more of the area tomorrow? I find myself curious about the land my brother intends to purchase." Jackson knew he should refuse. He had supplies to deliver to his cabin, preparations to make for the months between drives. More importantly, he had a lifetime rule of avoiding entanglements, especially with someone as intriguing and potentially disruptive to his solitary existence as Pearl Whitaker. "I'll call for you at 10, he heard himself say instead. "Wear riding clothes if you have them. The best views require horseback." Her smile of delight was both reward and warning, a sign that the safe isolation he had cultivated for years was already beginning to crumble. That night, alone in his room above the livery, Jackson cleaned his revolver and contemplated the strange turn his routine had taken. Pearl Whitaker was dangerous, but not in any way he had been trained to defend against. She threatened not his physical safety, but the emotional fortress he had built around himself since his parents' deaths. "It's just a courtesy to a newcomer," he told himself as he reassembled his weapon with practiced hands. "Nothing more." But as sleep finally claimed him, his dreams were filled with honey-blonde hair and storm-gray eyes that somehow spoke volumes without making a sound. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that made even the harshest landscape seem full of promise. Jackson arrived at Widow Jenkins' house precisely at 10, leading a gentle mare he had borrowed from the livery for Pearl. When she emerged, he momentarily lost his composure. Gone was the demure calico dress of yesterday, replaced by a practical riding outfit that somehow enhanced rather than diminished her femininity. She wore a divided skirt of sturdy brown fabric, a crisp white shirtwaist, and a short jacket that accentuated her slender waist. Her honey-blonde hair was braided and pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face from the sun. "You look," Jackson paused, searching for words that wouldn't overstep propriety, "well equipped for the trail." Pearl's eyes sparkled with amusement as she wrote, "I believe you mean to say I look scandalous in men's attire. Widow Jenkins nearly fainted when I unpacked my riding clothes." Jackson couldn't help laughing. "I can imagine, but out here, practicality trumps convention. You'll be more comfortable riding astride than side-saddle on these trails." She nodded in agreement, then approached the mare with the same confident ease she had shown with the stallion. After a brief introduction to the animal, she mounted smoothly, settling into the saddle with the grace of an experienced rider. They rode out of town heading west, following a trail that wound through stands of ponderosa pine and across meadows already lush with spring growth. Jackson found himself talking more than he had in years, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the region. Pearl listened attentively, occasionally stopping to write questions or observations. Around midday, they reached a high plateau overlooking a verdant valley bisected by a silver ribbon of river. Distant mountains, still capped with snow, formed a dramatic backdrop. "This is Jenkins Valley," Jackson explained as they dismounted to rest the horses. "Some of the best grazing land in the territory. Your brother shows good judgment if this is what he's looking to buy." Pearl removed her notebook from her saddlebag and wrote, "My brother Benjamin is very thorough in his research. He sent me ahead to ensure the area was as promising as reported before finalizing the purchase." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "He sent you alone to scout frontier property. That seems unusual." Her pencil hesitated before continuing, "Benjamin trusts my judgment, and I am not as defenseless as I appear." As if to prove her point, she reached into her jacket and withdrew a small derringer, a lady's gun but deadly at close range. "I see you come prepared," Jackson said, impressed again by her practicality. "Still, the West holds dangers beyond those solved by firearms. Isolation can be as deadly as any outlaw." Pearl returned the derringer to its hiding place before writing, "Is that why you choose to remain alone, Mr. Caldwell? Fear of isolation?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I believe it's the opposite, Miss Whitaker. I choose isolation precisely because it's safer than the alternative." She tilted her head questioningly, prompting him to continue. "When you rely on no one, you can't be disappointed when they fail you. When you love nothing, you have nothing to lose." The words came out harsher than he intended, revealing more than he normally would to someone he barely knew. Pearl considered this before writing. That sounds less like safety and more like surrender. Before Jackson could respond, a distant gunshot echoed across the valley, followed by several more in rapid succession. Both of them tensed, scanning the horizon. "Trouble," Jackson muttered, instantly alert. "We should head back." Pearl pointed toward a plume of smoke rising from the direction of a small homestead visible in the distance. She quickly wrote, "Someone might need help." Jackson's instinct for self-preservation warred with his sense of duty. The frontier code was clear. You help those in need because someday you might be the one requiring assistance. But involving Pearl in potential danger went against everything he believed about keeping safe in this untamed land. "I'll go check. You stay with the horses in those trees," he decided, pointing to a copse providing good cover. Pearl's expression hardened as she wrote firmly, "I'm coming with you. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Her stubbornness both frustrated and impressed him. After a moment's consideration, he nodded reluctantly. "Stay behind me, keep your derringer ready, and if I say run, you don't question it. Understood?" She nodded gravely, her storm-gray eyes reflecting determination rather than fear. They approached the homestead cautiously, using the natural contours of the land for cover. As they drew closer, they could see that the small log cabin appeared intact, but the outlying barn was engulfed in flames. A man and woman worked desperately to control the fire, while keeping anxious watch on the surrounding area. Jackson recognized them, the Haywards, a young couple who had staked their claim the previous year. He had occasionally traded with them while passing through. "Thomas," he called out, ensuring they saw him before approaching. "It's Jackson Caldwell, what happened?" Thomas Hayward, his face streaked with soot and sweat, looked up with visible relief. "Jackson, thank God, rustlers hit us, 4 of them. Took half our cattle and fired the barn when we tried to stop them." "Anyone hurt?" Jackson dismounted swiftly, Pearl following suit. "Sarah took a graze to the arm, but she'll be all right," Thomas replied, gesturing to his wife, who was cradling her left arm but still stubbornly throwing buckets of water on the fire with her right. "The bastards headed south, toward Raven Gorge," Thomas continued. "Sheriff won't get here in time even if someone rides for him." Jackson assessed the situation quickly. The barn was likely beyond saving, but they could still help protect the house and remaining livestock. "Miss Whitaker, would you assist Mrs. Hayward?" he asked, already moving toward the well to help draw more water. To his surprise, Pearl instead approached Sarah directly, gesturing to her injured arm. After a brief exchange of nods, Pearl led the woman to a nearby stump and began examining the wound. From her saddlebag, she produced a small medical kit and set to work cleaning and bandaging Sarah's arm with practiced efficiency. "Your friend seems to know what she's doing," Thomas observed as he and Jackson formed a bucket line to the fire. "She's full of surprises," Jackson replied, watching as Pearl completed her ministrations and then joined Sarah in salvaging what they could from the burning barn. For the next 2 hours, the 4 of them worked together, containing the fire, securing the remaining livestock, and reinforcing the cabin's defenses in case the rustlers returned. Throughout it all, Pearl worked tirelessly, her inability to speak seeming almost irrelevant as she communicated through gestures and expressions, anticipating needs before they were voiced. By late afternoon, they had done all they could. The barn was a smoldering ruin, but the house stood untouched, and the Haywards still had enough cattle to rebuild their herd. "We can't thank you enough," Sarah said as she pressed a bundle of freshly baked bread into Pearl's hands. "Both of you." Pearl smiled warmly and embraced the woman, then wrote a quick note that Sarah read aloud. "Neighbors help neighbors. I hope to be one soon." As they prepared to leave, Thomas pulled Jackson aside. "Those rustlers weren't just passing through, Jackson. They asked specific questions about who owned what land and where the boundaries lay. I'd wager they're working for someone looking to consolidate holdings." Jackson frowned. "You have any idea who?" "Talk in town says Cyrus Blackwater's been buying up distressed properties all through the territory. These aren't the first accidents to befall folks who won't sell." The name was familiar. A wealthy Easterner who had arrived in Colorado the previous year with grand ambitions and seemingly endless capital. Jackson had paid little attention to the rumors, preferring to keep his distance from local politics. "Watch yourself," Thomas warned, "and tell your lady friend to be careful if her brother's looking to buy around here. Blackwater doesn't take kindly to competition." Jackson wanted to correct the assumption about his relationship with Pearl, but something held him back. "We'll be careful," he promised instead. As they rode away from the homestead, the sun was beginning to set, painting the landscape in gold and crimson. Pearl's expression was thoughtful, her eyes occasionally darting to Jackson's face as if studying him. Finally, she pulled her horse to a stop and wrote in her notebook, "You were different back there. Not the man who believes it's safer to be alone." Jackson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The frontier demands certain behaviors. Helping neighbors is necessary for survival, not a sign of attachment. Pearl's pencil moved swiftly. "Is that what you tell yourself to maintain your isolation? That kindness is merely practical, not human." Her words cut closer to truth than he cared to admit. "We should keep moving," he said instead of answering. "I want to get you back to town before dark." They rode in silence for several miles, the tension between them palpable. Jackson found himself increasingly unsettled, not by Pearl's challenging questions, but by his own reaction to them. She had somehow penetrated defenses that had stood firm for years, making him question convictions that had defined his life since childhood. As the lights of Red Creek came into view, Pearl passed him another note. "Thank you for today. Despite the danger, it was illuminating. Perhaps you're not as committed to solitude as you believe." Jackson read the words several times before responding. "Perhaps you see what you wish to see, Miss Whitaker." Her smile was enigmatic as she wrote, "Or perhaps I simply see what you cannot." He escorted her to Widow Jenkins' door, acutely aware of the older woman watching through the window with barely disguised curiosity. The town would be buzzing with speculation by morning, the reclusive drover and the mute newcomer, spending an entire day unchaperoned in the wilderness. "Will you call on me again tomorrow?" Pearl wrote, her expression hopeful. Every instinct warned Jackson to distance himself from this woman who threatened the careful boundaries he had established. Yet he found himself nodding. "I have business in town. Perhaps we could meet for lunch at the hotel restaurant." Her face brightened with a smile that made his chest tighten inexplicably. As she turned to enter the house, Jackson was struck by the realization that in just 2 days, Pearl Whitaker had somehow become more than a curiosity. She had become important. The thought terrified him more than any rustler's gun. The following days established a pattern that both disturbed and exhilarated Jackson. Each morning, he would find some reason to remain in town rather than retreat to his isolated cabin. Each afternoon, he would spend hours with Pearl, showing her the countryside, introducing her to townspeople, or simply sitting in companionable silence as she sketched in her notebook and he cleaned his tack. Their communication developed its own rhythm. Pearl's written notes became less necessary as Jackson grew adept at reading her expressions and gestures. In turn, he found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, sharing stories of cattle drives and frontier adventures that he had previously kept locked away. A week after their first meeting, they sat together on the hotel's small veranda, watching the afternoon activity on Red Creek's main street. Pearl was sketching the mountains visible beyond the town, her pencil moving with the same grace that characterized all her movements. "You have a gift," Jackson observed, impressed by the detail she captured. "Have you always been artistic?" Pearl set aside her drawing to write. "After losing my voice, I needed other ways to express myself. Art became my speech." "It suits you," he said, studying the delicate lines of her profile as she returned to her work. "Though I find I can understand you quite well without words or pictures." She glanced up, a question in her eyes. "You speak with your expressions, your gestures," he explained. "Once a person pays attention, your silence becomes eloquent." Pearl's face softened with pleasure at his observation. She wrote quickly, "Few people have ever taken the time to truly see me beyond my disability. They speak louder, as if I were deaf instead of mute, or they avoid conversation altogether." "Their loss," Jackson said simply. She studied him for a long moment before writing, "Why are you different, Jackson Caldwell? You, who claim to prefer isolation, have shown more patience with my silence than those who live surrounded by community." It was a question Jackson had asked himself repeatedly over the past week. Why had this silent woman breached defenses that had repelled all others? What was it about Pearl Whitaker that made him question beliefs he had held as gospel for 12 years? Before he could formulate an answer, a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A fancy carriage pulled by 4 matched black horses had stopped in front of the Red Creek bank. Several well-dressed men descended, their manner projecting authority and wealth. "Speak of the devil," muttered Silas Potter, the hotel owner who had been sweeping nearby. "That's Cyrus Blackwater himself." Jackson straightened, recalling Thomas Hayward's warning about the land baron. He observed the newcomers with interest, particularly the central figure. A tall, imposing man in his 40s, expensively dressed and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. Pearl touched Jackson's arm, drawing his attention to her notebook. "Is that the man the Haywards mentioned, the one possibly behind the rustlers?" "It would seem so," Jackson confirmed quietly, "though no one's been able to prove anything." They watched as Blackwater and his entourage entered the bank. Minutes later, Sheriff Mills hurried across the street to join them, hat in hand like a supplicant rather than a law enforcement officer. "That's not encouraging," Jackson observed. "If the sheriff's in Blackwater's pocket, the Haywards and others like them have little recourse against these accidents." Pearl's expression hardened as she wrote, "My brother would be interested to know about this situation. He has connections in Denver who might be able to investigate properly." "Your brother sounds like an unusual businessman," Jackson remarked. "Most investors would avoid areas with such complications." Pearl hesitated before responding. "Benjamin believes in doing things properly, even when it's difficult. Our father taught us that profit without principle is meaningless." As they spoke, the bank door opened again, and Blackwater emerged, scanning the street with the assessing gaze of a man mentally calculating ownership. His eyes passed over the hotel veranda, pausing momentarily on Pearl. Even from a distance, Jackson could see the man's expression shift from casual observation to focused interest. Something about that look, possessive, evaluating, caused a surge of protectiveness in Jackson that took him by surprise. Blackwater said something to one of his companions, who glanced toward Pearl and nodded. Then, to Jackson's dismay, the entire group began moving toward the hotel. "Miss Whitaker," Blackwater called as he approached, his voice cultured but carrying an undertone that set Jackson's teeth on edge. "I believe I've had correspondence with your brother regarding certain properties. What a delightful surprise to find you here in advance of our meeting." Pearl's eyebrows rose in evident surprise. She looked to Jackson momentarily before turning back to Blackwater with a polite but reserved expression. "Forgive me," Blackwater continued smoothly. "Sheriff Mills mentioned your presence in town and your unique circumstance." He gestured vaguely toward his throat, a motion that somehow managed to be both acknowledging and dismissive of Pearl's muteness. Jackson felt a flash of anger at the man's presumption. "Miss Whitaker communicates quite effectively, Mr. Blackwater, when she chooses to do so." Blackwater's attention shifted to Jackson, his gaze coolly appraising. "And you are?" "Jackson Caldwell." "Ah, a drover, I believe. Sheriff Mills mentioned you. How fortunate for Miss Whitaker to have found such a rustic guide to our little corner of the territory." The condescension was unmistakable. Jackson felt his hand instinctively move closer to his revolver, a motion not lost on Blackwater, whose smile merely widened. Pearl intervened, writing quickly and turning her notebook toward Blackwater. "Mr. Caldwell has been kind enough to acquaint me with the region while I await my brother's arrival. I was unaware you had business with Benjamin." Blackwater read the note with raised eyebrows. "Indeed. Your brother and I have been discussing the consolidation of certain land parcels. I was under the impression he had sent you to finalize matters in his absence." Pearl's expression revealed nothing as she wrote again. "My brother's business is his own. I'm merely scouting the area's suitability for his plans." "Of course," Blackwater replied, though his tone suggested disbelief. "When do you expect him?" "Within the month," Pearl wrote, her pencil moving with deliberate precision. Blackwater smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent, I look forward to meeting him. Perhaps you and your friend would join me for dinner tonight. The hotel serves a passable meal, I'm told." Jackson tensed, sensing an underlying current to the invitation. Before he could speak, Pearl had written her response. "Thank you, but we have prior commitments. Another time, perhaps." "As you wish." Blackwater tipped his hat, his gaze lingering on Pearl a moment longer than propriety allowed. "Until we meet again, Miss Whitaker, Mr. Caldwell." As the group departed, Jackson released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I dislike that man intensely," he muttered. Pearl nodded in agreement, then wrote, He knows more about my brother than he should, given that Benjamin has conducted all his business through lawyers in Denver. Do you think your brother is actually negotiating with him? Pearl's expression grew troubled as she wrote. It's possible, though Benjamin would have told me. More likely, Blackwater has been intercepting correspondence or bribing officials for information. Either way, it might be wise to send word to your brother about what we learned from the Haywards, Jackson suggested. If Blackwater is behind the rustling and intimidation, your brother should know what he's potentially facing. Pearl nodded, her expression resolute as she wrote, I'll draft a letter immediately. Would you ensure it gets on tomorrow's eastbound stage? Of course, Jackson agreed, finding himself once again drawn deeper into Pearl's affairs despite his long-standing policy of non-involvement. Later that evening, after escorting Pearl back to Widow Jenkins' house, Jackson found himself in the Rusty Nail Saloon, a place he typically avoided. The noisy, smoke-filled room represented everything he distrusted about town life: too many people, too many conflicting interests, too many opportunities for trouble. But tonight he needed information, and saloons were the clearinghouses of frontier intelligence. He nursed a whiskey at the bar, listening more than talking, gathering fragments of conversation about Blackwater and his operations. Caldwell, ain't often we see you darkening our doorway, called Mitch Hansen, the blacksmith, from a nearby table. What brings you down from your mountain hideaway? Jackson shrugged noncommittally. Just passing time before the next drive. Hansen grinned knowingly. Wouldn't have anything to do with that pretty blonde you've been squiring around town, would it? Several men at the table chuckled, and Jackson felt his jaw tighten. Miss Whitaker is new to the area. I'm simply showing her around as a courtesy. Mighty generous courtesy, observed a rancher named Donovan, especially for a man known for keeping to himself. Jackson changed the subject. What's the word on Blackwater? I saw him in town today. The men exchanged glances. Bad business, that one, Hansen said, lowering his voice. Came in with Eastern money, buying up every parcel he can get. Those who won't sell tend to run into difficulties. Like the Haywards? Jackson asked. Donovan nodded grimly. Them and others. The Petersons lost their entire corn crop to mysterious fire last fall. The Miller place had their water rights suddenly disputed by the territorial court. Always something, and always ending with Blackwater offering to buy the distressed property at half its value. And the sheriff? Hansen spat disgustedly. Mills was straight enough before Blackwater arrived. Now he looks the other way for the right price, the judge too. Nobody stands up to him, Jackson pressed. With what? Money talks in the territory these days, Donovan replied. Unless you've got the kind of capital to fight him in court or the men to stand against his hired guns, most folks eventually give in. Jackson digested this information thoughtfully. What about newcomers? Anyone buying land besides Blackwater? Heard rumors of some eastern outfit looking at the Jenkins Valley region, Hansen said. Blackwater's been pushing hard to close those deals before competition arrives. The blacksmith leaned forward. Word is that might be why your Miss Whitaker's here. Her brother's supposedly representing substantial interests. Jackson maintained a neutral expression, though the information aligned with what Pearl had suggested. She's not my Miss Whitaker, he corrected automatically. The men laughed. Keep telling yourself that, Caldwell, Hansen said. Meanwhile, the whole town's taking bets on when you'll stop pretending you ain't sweet on her. Jackson finished his whiskey in a single swallow, irritated by their presumption but more unsettled by the kernel of truth in it. Appreciate the information, he said, placing coins on the bar. Good night, gentlemen. As he stepped into the cool night air, Jackson found himself facing an uncomfortable realization. In little more than a week, Pearl Whitaker had become central to his thoughts in a way no one had been for 12 years. Worse, his growing involvement with her had placed him squarely in the path of Cyrus Blackwater's ambitions, exactly the kind of entanglement he had always avoided. The sensible course was clear. Deliver Pearl's letter to the stage, make his excuses, and retreat to his cabin until her brother arrived to take responsibility for her. It was the safe choice, the logical choice. Yet as he walked back to his room above the livery, Jackson knew with unsettling certainty that he would do no such thing. Something fundamental had shifted inside him, challenging the belief that had guided him since his parents' deaths. That isolation was the surest protection against loss. For the first time in years, Jackson Caldwell was beginning to wonder if what he had been protecting wasn't his heart, but merely its empty shell. The following morning, Jackson awoke to commotion in the street below his window. Peering out, he saw a crowd gathering in front of the sheriff's office. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, where the livery owner was already gossiping with several townspeople. "What's happened?" Jackson asked. "Hayward Place got hit again last night," the man replied grimly. "Worse this time, house burned to the ground and Thomas took a bullet." Jackson felt his blood run cold. "Is he alive?" "Barely. They brought him in on a wagon at dawn. Sarah's with Doc Evans now, but it don't look good." Without waiting to hear more, Jackson strode toward the doctor's small office at the end of the street. The crowd parted for him, whispers following in his wake. He found Sarah Hayward sitting on a bench outside the surgery, her face ashen, clothes still smudged with soot and blood. "Sarah," he said quietly, sitting beside her. "I just heard." She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "They came back, Jackson. 4 of them, just like before, but this time they didn't bother with the cattle. They went straight for the house, said it was a message for anyone thinking of holding out against Mr. Blackwater." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Did you recognize any of them?" One called another Reeves, dark-haired man with a scar through his eyebrow. She clutched Jackson's arm suddenly. "They knew about you and Miss Whitaker coming to help us. Said next time they'd be visiting her." Alarm coursed through Jackson. "I need to go," he said, standing abruptly. "Is there anything you need?" Sarah shook her head numbly. "Just pray for Thomas, Doc says." Her voice broke. "Doc says it doesn't look good." Jackson squeezed her shoulder gently, then turned and headed straight for Widow Jenkins' house, fear quickening his steps. When he arrived, he found the widow in her garden, calmly tending her flowers. "Mrs. Jenkins," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is Miss Whitaker at home?" The older woman straightened, eyeing him suspiciously. "She left at first light, Mr. Caldwell. Said she was meeting you at the livery to go riding." Jackson felt his heart drop. "I made no such arrangement." Alarm crossed Mrs. Jenkins' weathered face. "But she had a note, delivered last night after you'd left her here. Said it was from you, asking her to meet you early to ride out to some valley she wanted to see again." "Jenkins Valley," Jackson said grimly, already turning back toward the street. "Did she say anything else?" "Only that she might be gone most of the day. Mr. Caldwell, what's wrong?" But Jackson was already running toward the livery, cold dread settling in his stomach. If Pearl had been lured out believing she was meeting him, she was riding into danger. The threat against her, coming so soon after Blackwater's appearance in town and the attack on the Haywards, couldn't be coincidence. At the livery, his fears were confirmed. Pearl had indeed taken the gentle mare early that morning, telling the stable hand she was meeting Jackson on the trail to Jenkins Valley. Within minutes, Jackson had saddled his gelding and was galloping out of town, his revolver checked and loaded, a rifle secured to his saddle. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. If Blackwater's men had targeted Pearl to eliminate competition or leverage her against her brother, they wouldn't hesitate to harm her, or worse. The trail to Jenkins Valley stretched before him, each hoofbeat echoing his self-recrimination. He had known the risks of becoming involved, had spent years avoiding precisely this kind of situation. Yet he had allowed himself to care for Pearl, and now she was in danger because of it. "Trust gets you killed out west," his father's words echoed in his memory. But for the first time, Jackson wondered if the opposite might be equally true, if isolation, rather than protecting him, had simply ensured he would face danger alone. As he crested a rise overlooking the valley, Jackson reined in his horse sharply. In the distance, he could see 3 riders flanking a fourth, Pearl, unmistakable even at this distance. They were heading not toward town but deeper into the valley, toward Raven Gorge, a remote area where a body might not be found for weeks. Cold fury replaced fear. Jackson assessed his options quickly. The direct approach would likely get both him and Pearl killed. But if he could circle around through the pine forest to the north, he might intercept them near the entrance to the gorge, where the terrain would give him some advantage. Without hesitation, he turned his horse into the trees, pushing the animal as fast as the dense forest would allow. Time seemed to stretch as he navigated the rough terrain, every moment bringing Pearl closer to whatever fate Blackwater's men had planned for her. After what felt like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, Jackson emerged from the forest at a point overlooking the trail into Raven Gorge. Below him, not 200 yards away, the 4 riders had stopped. Pearl was still mounted, her posture defiant despite being surrounded by 3 armed men. Jackson dismounted quietly, tethering his horse before moving to a better vantage point with his rifle. From his new position he could see Pearl's face, calm but alert, showing no sign of the terror most would feel in her situation. One of the men was speaking to her, gesturing emphatically. Jackson recognized him from Sarah's description, Reeves, the dark-haired man with the scarred eyebrow. As he watched, Reeves reached for Pearl's reins, clearly intending to lead her horse into the gorge. It was now or never. Jackson sighted down his rifle, took a deep breath, and fired. The shot echoed across the valley as Reeves' hat flew from his head. The man ducked instinctively, releasing Pearl's reins. The other 2 men drew their weapons, scanning the ridgeline. "That was a warning," Jackson shouted, keeping his position concealed. "The next one goes between your eyes, Reeves." Confusion and alarm spread among the men. Pearl, seizing the moment of distraction, suddenly kicked her horse forward, breaking through the circle and galloping directly toward Jackson's position with an instinct that impressed him even amid the danger. "Kill her," Reeves shouted, raising his revolver. Jackson fired again, this time hitting Reeves in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The other 2 men hesitated, caught between pursuing Pearl and helping their fallen leader. Pearl reached the base of the ridge where Jackson was hidden, dismounting and scrambling up the steep incline with remarkable agility. Halfway up she slipped, a small cry, the first sound Jackson had ever heard from her, escaping her lips. "I've got you," he called, reaching down to grasp her hand and pull her the rest of the way up. For a moment they stared at each other, Pearl's storm-gray eyes wide with relief and something more complex. A bullet whizzed past them, shattering bark from a nearby tree. The remaining 2 men had decided to give chase. "Can you ride?" Jackson asked urgently. Pearl nodded, already moving toward his horse. "Take him and head back to town," Jackson instructed, passing her the reins. "I'll hold them off and follow when I can." She shook her head vehemently, pointing to the horse, then to both of them. "There's no time to argue," Jackson insisted. "They'll kill us both if they catch us. This way at least you'll be safe." Pearl's expression hardened with determination. She reached for her notebook, scribbling hastily before shoving it into his hands. "I will not leave you to die for me, together or not at all." The fierce conviction in her eyes staggered him. In that moment, Jackson recognized what had been growing between them, a bond forged through silent understanding and mutual respect, stronger than any he had allowed himself to form since his parents' deaths. Another shot rang out, closer this time. "Together then," Jackson conceded, helping Pearl onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Hold tight." With Pearl secure in front of him, one arm wrapped protectively around her waist, Jackson urged his horse into the dense forest. The gelding responded admirably, picking its way through the undergrowth with sure-footed determination. Behind them they could hear Reeves shouting orders, the sounds of pursuit fading as the forest thickened. Jackson chose a route that would be difficult to follow, doubling back several times to confuse their trail. As they rode, the realization of how close he had come to losing Pearl hit him with physical force. The thought was unbearable in a way that shocked him, as if some vital part of himself would have been lost with her. After nearly an hour of hard riding, they emerged from the forest near a small creek, well away from both the gorge and the main trail. Jackson finally slowed, allowing his exhausted horse to drink while he helped Pearl dismount. She was trembling slightly, the day's events catching up with her now that immediate danger had passed. Without thinking, Jackson pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if to reassure himself that she was truly safe. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured against her hair. Pearl drew back slightly, her storm-gray eyes searching his face. She reached up, her fingers tracing his jawline with a tenderness that made his breath catch. Then, with deliberate slowness, she stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepening as Jackson responded, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other drew her closer. In that moment, all his carefully constructed defenses crumbled completely, swept away by the flood of emotions he had denied for so long. When they finally parted, both breathless, Pearl's eyes shone with unspoken feelings. She reached for her notebook, but Jackson caught her hand. "You don't need words," he said softly. "I understand." She smiled, the expression illuminating her face in a way that made his heart constrict painfully. Then her expression grew serious again as she freed her hand and wrote, "Blackwater knows who I am. He sent those men to either kill me or use me against my brother." Jackson nodded grimly. "The Haywards were attacked again last night. Thomas was shot, it's bad. Sarah said they mentioned you specifically." Pearl's expression hardened with resolve as she wrote, "We need to reach my brother immediately. This has gone beyond business rivalry." "Your brother's coming here would play into Blackwater's hands," Jackson pointed out. "If he's as connected as you say, he'd be better positioned to fight from Denver." Pearl hesitated before writing, "There's something I haven't told you about Benjamin. He's not just a businessman." Jackson waited, sensing she was about to reveal something significant. "Benjamin is a federal marshal, investigating Blackwater for land fraud and possibly murder across 3 territories. I'm here not just to scout land, but to gather evidence of his operations." The revelation stunned Jackson. "You're working with the federal government, Pearl, that's incredibly dangerous." She nodded, acknowledging the risk before writing, "I volunteered. My condition makes people underestimate me. They speak freely, assuming I can't report what I hear. Benjamin was against it, but I insisted." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, trying to process this new information. "So the land purchases are legitimate but secondary to the investigation," Pearl confirmed in writing. "Benjamin needed a plausible reason for interest in the area that would draw Blackwater's attention without raising suspicion." "And now Blackwater's men have tried to abduct or kill you," Jackson said, the implications settling heavily. "We need to get back to town and send an urgent telegram to your brother." Pearl nodded in agreement, though her expression remained troubled as she wrote, "What about you? By helping me, you've made yourself a target too." The question gave Jackson pause. A week ago his answer would have been simple: retreat to his cabin, avoid involvement, protect himself at all costs. Now, looking at Pearl, he realized how hollow that existence had been. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said with quiet certainty, "for the first time in 12 years. The smile that bloomed across Pearl's face was worth every risk, every danger they might face. As they prepared to continue their journey back to Red Creek, Jackson found himself contemplating a future vastly different from the solitary existence he had planned, one that included the silent woman who had somehow spoken directly to his long-dormant heart. They reached town as dusk was falling, taking a circuitous route to avoid being seen. Rather than risk returning to Widow Jenkins' house or the livery, Jackson led Pearl to the small church at the edge of town, where Pastor Mitchell had always offered sanctuary to those in need. The pastor received them without questions, providing food and a place to rest while Jackson explained their situation. When he understood the gravity of the threat, Mitchell offered to deliver a telegram to the stage depot himself, ensuring it would reach Denver without raising suspicion. Pearl drafted a coded message that would alert her brother to the danger without revealing too much if intercepted. While the pastor was gone, she and Jackson discussed their next steps. "You should stay here until your brother arrives with reinforcements," Jackson advised. "It's the safest place in town." Pearl shook her head firmly, writing, "Blackwater will suspect the church first. We need somewhere unexpected." "My cabin," Jackson suggested after a moment's thought. "It's isolated, defensible, and few people know its exact location." Pearl considered this, then wrote, "Won't Blackwater's men check there too, knowing we're connected?" The hesitation in her writing reflected the unspoken question between them. Exactly what were they to each other now? "They might," Jackson acknowledged. "But it would give us time, at least, and I know every approach, every hiding place in those hills." Before Pearl could respond, Pastor Mitchell returned, his expression grave. "Message sent, but there's troubling news. Blackwater's men are all over town, searching every building. They're claiming Miss Whitaker was abducted by a dangerous criminal." He looked pointedly at Jackson. "They have a wanted poster with your face on it, son." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Convenient, what am I supposedly wanted for?" "Murder in Wyoming territory, 2 years ago." Mitchell's eyes reflected his disbelief at the charge. "Sheriff Mills is organizing a posse to track you down." "A posse of Blackwater's men, no doubt," Jackson said bitterly. "This changes things. We can't stay in town and we can't go to my cabin. It'll be the first place they look." Pearl touched his arm, drawing his attention to her notebook. "The Petersons' old homestead, north of Jenkins Valley. You said it was abandoned after they lost their crops." Jackson considered this. "It's risky. Blackwater knows the property, but it's also the last place they might expect us to go." He turned to Mitchell. "How long until the stage reaches Denver?" 2 days minimum, plus however long it takes to locate Miss Whitaker's brother, and for him to travel here. "So we need to stay hidden for at least 3 or 4 days, Jackson concluded. "The Peterson place might work, especially if we can make it look like we've fled in the opposite direction." Pearl nodded in agreement, already writing, "We'll need supplies. Food, water, ammunition." Mitchell moved to a cabinet at the back of the church. "I can help with that. I keep emergency provisions for those in need." He began gathering items into a sack. "There's a back door through the cemetery. You can slip out that way and reach the northern trail without being seen from town." As they prepared to leave, Pearl wrote a note thanking the pastor for his help and asking him to check on Sarah Hayward when possible. "God be with you both," Mitchell said, handing them the supplies. "I'll pray for your safety and for justice to prevail." Under cover of darkness, they slipped away from the church, leading Jackson's horse quietly through the cemetery and into the pines beyond. Once they were safely beyond the town's perimeter, Jackson helped Pearl mount, then swung up behind her. "It's about 2 hours to the Peterson place," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "We'll need to avoid the main trails." Pearl leaned back against his chest, her silent presence somehow more comforting than any words could have been. As they rode through the moonlit forest, Jackson marveled at how completely his life had changed in little more than a week. The man who had prided himself on needing no one was now risking everything for a woman he had just met, and feeling more alive than he had in 12 years. They reached the abandoned homestead shortly after midnight. The small cabin stood dark and empty, its windows broken, the surrounding fields overgrown with weeds. Jackson approached cautiously, revolver drawn, but found no signs of recent habitation. Inside, the cabin was dusty but largely intact. A table, 2 chairs, and a simple bed frame remained, along with a cast-iron stove. Jackson lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low to avoid detection from outside. "It's not much," he apologized as Pearl surveyed their temporary refuge, "but it should serve until help arrives." She smiled reassuringly, writing, "I've stayed in worse places during this investigation. At least this has a roof." Her resilience continued to impress him. Most women of her background would have been overwhelmed by the day's events, yet Pearl remained calm and determined, her storm-gray eyes clear and focused. They worked together to make the cabin more habitable, sweeping away dust and cobwebs, checking the stove to ensure it wouldn't smoke visibly when lit. Jackson found a small spring behind the house, providing fresh water. By dawn, they had created a reasonably comfortable hideout. While Pearl organized their supplies, Jackson scouted the surrounding area, identifying escape routes and potential lookout points. When he returned, he found her asleep on the bed, which she had covered with a clean blanket from their provisions. Exhaustion had finally claimed her, the strain of the day evident in the slight furrow of her brow even in sleep. Jackson stood watching her, a profound protectiveness washing over him. In that moment he made a silent vow. Whatever happened, whatever it cost him, he would keep her safe. He settled into a chair by the window, revolver ready, prepared to stand guard while she slept. As the first light of dawn filtered through the broken panes, he contemplated the irony of his situation. He, who had spent years avoiding attachment to avoid pain, now found himself willing to die for someone he had known less than 2 weeks. Pearl awoke mid-morning, stretching like a cat before becoming fully alert to their surroundings. When she saw Jackson still at his post by the window, her expression softened with concern. She reached for her notebook. "Have you slept at all?" He shook his head. "I'll rest later," wanted to make sure we weren't followed. She frowned, writing, "You can't protect me if you collapse from exhaustion. We should take watches." "I know how to use a gun." The image of Pearl with her small derringer caused a reluctant smile. "I don't doubt your courage, but I'd prefer you didn't have to use it." Her response was immediate. "And I'd prefer you didn't treat me as helpless because I cannot speak. I've survived on my own for years." The gentle rebuke was deserved. Jackson nodded his acceptance. "You're right. We're partners in this, not protector and protected." The word partners hung between them, carrying implications beyond their immediate situation. Pearl studied his face for a long moment before writing, "What happens after?" "When Benjamin arrives and Blackwater is dealt with." It was the question Jackson had been avoiding since their kiss by the creek, a future he hadn't dared contemplate during years of deliberate isolation. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I've spent so long convincing myself that being alone was safer that I never considered an alternative. Until you." Pearl's expression softened as she wrote, "And now. Now I can't imagine going back to that emptiness." The words came more easily than he had expected, as if admitting the truth aloud had released something long trapped inside him. "You've shown me that what I thought was safety was really just fear. Fear of losing someone I cared about, like I lost my parents." Pearl moved to kneel before him, taking his hands in hers. Her eyes communicated what words could not, understanding, compassion, and something deeper that made his heart race. She released his hands to write, "We cannot know what tomorrow brings, Jackson. But I would rather face whatever comes with you than return to a life of safe isolation." The simple truth of her statement resonated deeply. Jackson reached out, gently tucking a strand of honey-blonde hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Then perhaps when this is over we could see what might be possible," he suggested, his voice low with emotion. "Together." The smile that illuminated her face was answer enough, but she wrote nevertheless. "I would like that very much." The tender moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats, several horses approaching from the direction of town. Jackson was on his feet instantly, peering cautiously through the broken window. "Riders coming," he reported grimly. 5, maybe 6 of them." Pearl joined him at the window, her expression determined as she wrote, "Blackwater's men. Likely they're moving with purpose, checking the landscape." Jackson assessed their options quickly. "They haven't spotted us yet, but they will if they come much closer. We need to move." Pearl nodded, already gathering their essential supplies into a small pack. Jackson retrieved his rifle, checking that it was loaded and ready. "There's a ravine behind the house that leads up into the foothills," he explained as they prepared to leave. "If we can reach it without being seen, we can lose them in the higher terrain." They slipped out through the back door, keeping low and using the overgrown garden for cover. The riders were now visible on the main trail about half a mile away, spreading out in a search pattern that would eventually bring them to the homestead. Jackson led Pearl toward the ravine, moving as quickly as caution allowed. They had nearly reached the shelter of the rocky gulch when a shout went up from the riders. They had been spotted. "Run," Jackson urged, pushing Pearl ahead of him toward the ravine. Behind them, horses thundered across the open ground, rapidly closing the distance. They scrambled down into the ravine just as the first shots rang out, bullets kicking up dirt around them. The steep walls provided some cover, but they were now committed to a route that could easily become a trap if Blackwater's men circled around to the other end. "This way," Jackson directed, heading uphill along the ravine floor. The terrain was rough, requiring both hands for climbing in some places. Pearl kept pace remarkably well, her determination evident in every movement. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant as they climbed higher into the rugged foothills. The ravine eventually opened into a labyrinth of smaller gullies and rock formations that would be difficult to navigate without knowledge of the area. Knowledge that Jackson, fortunately, possessed from his hunting trips. By midday they had reached a small plateau overlooking the valley, concealed from below by a stand of pines. They paused to rest and assess their situation, the Peterson homestead now a tiny speck in the distance. "I think we've lost them for now," Jackson said, scanning the terrain below. "But they'll keep searching. Blackwater can't afford to let you reach your brother with what you know." Pearl nodded grimly, then wrote, "We can't keep running in circles. We need to get to a place where we can send another message to Benjamin. The nearest telegraph outside of Red Creek is in Silverton, 20 miles east," Jackson replied. "But the terrain between here and there is exposed. We'd be easy targets." Pearl considered this before writing. "What about north toward the railroad at Clear Creek Junction? It's further but might be safer." Jackson weighed the options. 3 days hard travel, but you're right, the forest provides better cover all the way, and there's a federal office there where we could seek protection. They agreed on the northern route, planning to travel by night when possible to avoid detection. As they prepared to continue their journey, Jackson couldn't help but admire Pearl's composure in the face of such danger. Most people would have broken under the strain, yet she remained focused and resourceful. "You're remarkable," he said suddenly. "I've known hardened frontiersmen with less courage." Pearl's cheeks colored slightly at the praise. She wrote quickly, "Fear serves no purpose in situations like this. My father taught me that action is the antidote to helplessness. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," she wrote, a shadow of old grief crossing her face. "He died protecting our family from men not unlike Blackwater, powerful people who thought their money entitled them to whatever they wanted." Jackson understood then why this mission was personal for Pearl, why she had volunteered for such dangerous work despite her vulnerability. Like him, she had been shaped by loss, but where he had retreated from connection, she had chosen to fight against the forces that caused such pain. "We should move," he said softly, helping her to her feet. "We can put several more miles behind us before dark." As they continued their journey north, navigating the increasingly rugged terrain, Jackson found himself drawing strength from Pearl's quiet determination. The woman who could not speak had somehow taught him more about courage and connection than all his years on the frontier. For 3 days, they traveled through the wilderness, moving primarily at night and hiding during daylight hours. The journey was arduous, their progress slowed by the need for caution and the challenging landscape. They subsisted on the provisions Mitchell had provided, supplemented by Jackson's hunting skills when opportunity allowed. Throughout their ordeal, the bond between them deepened. Without the distractions of town life or the pressure of constant conversation, they developed a communication that transcended Pearl's written words, a harmony of gesture, expression, and understanding that felt more intimate than any relationship Jackson had known. On the evening of the 3rd day, they reached a ridge overlooking Clear Creek Junction. The small settlement, built around the railroad that connected Denver to the western mining towns, glowed with lamplight in the gathering dusk. "We made it," Jackson said, relief evident in his voice. "The telegraph office is near the station. We can send word to your brother and seek protection from the railroad marshal until he arrives." Pearl smiled wearily, the exhaustion of their journey evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. She wrote, "I knew we would. You're a good guide, Jackson Caldwell." "And you're a better partner than I deserve," he replied, the word carrying far more meaning than it had when first spoken in the abandoned homestead. They descended toward the town cautiously, alert for any sign that Blackwater's influence might extend to this settlement as well. The streets were quiet as they approached the telegraph office, most residents already retired to their homes. The operator, a middle-aged man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up in surprise when they entered. His eyes widened further at their trail-worn appearance. "Telegraph to Denver," Jackson requested, placing coins on the counter. "Urgent federal business." The man's skepticism was evident, but Pearl stepped forward, producing a small official document from her inner pocket. The operator examined it, his expression shifting from doubt to respect. "Yes, ma'am, right away." Pearl drafted another message to her brother, this one more detailed now that they had reached relative safety. The operator assured them it would be sent immediately and delivered to the federal marshal's office in Denver by morning. "Is there a place we can stay until we receive a reply?" Jackson asked. "Somewhere discreet." The operator nodded knowingly. "Mrs. Campbell's boarding house 2 streets over. Tell her Morton sent you. She's trustworthy and doesn't ask questions." They thanked him and headed to the boarding house, where the motherly Mrs. Campbell indeed asked no questions about their disheveled state or Pearl's muteness. She provided a simple but clean room with 2 narrow beds and promised hot water for bathing would be brought up immediately. Alone in the room at last, the tension of the past days began to dissipate. Pearl sank onto one of the beds, exhaustion finally overtaking her composed facade. Jackson sat beside her, gently taking her hand. "It's almost over," he assured her. "Your brother will come, Blackwater will face justice, and this nightmare will end." Pearl looked up at him, her storm-gray eyes searching his face before she wrote, "And then what becomes of us, Jackson? When I return to Denver and you to your cattle drives?" It was the question that had hovered between them throughout their journey, the uncertain future beyond their immediate danger. Jackson took a deep breath, finally confronting the truth he had been approaching since that first moment in the general store. "I don't want to return to that life," he said simply. "The cattle drives, the isolation, it was never what I truly wanted. It was just what felt safe after losing everyone I cared about." Pearl squeezed his hand encouragingly. "What I want," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "is a life with purpose, a home, not just a shelter, someone to share both with." He met her gaze directly. "I want you, Pearl. However that might be possible." Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of joy. She wrote quickly, her hand trembling slightly. "I want that too. I've spent years hiding behind my silence, using it as both shield and sword. But with you I'm simply myself, no disguise, no performance, just Pearl." Jackson lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "Then no matter what happens with Blackwater, we face it together. And whatever comes after, we face that together too." Pearl's response was to set aside her notebook and pencil entirely, leaning forward to kiss him with a passion that conveyed everything words could not. In that moment, all the fears and doubts that had plagued Jackson for 12 years seemed to dissolve, replaced by a certainty he had never expected to find. The following morning brought news, both expected and surprising. A telegram arrived from Benjamin Whitaker, confirming he was en route with a contingent of federal agents and would arrive by train the next day. More startling was the second telegram, addressed to Pearl from a reporter at the Denver Post. "BLACKWATER in Denver. Documents you sent exposed land fraud conspiracy. Territorial officials implicated. Story BRAKING tomorrow. CONGRATULATIONS on your investigative triumph." Pearl's expression as she read the message was one of stunned disbelief, quickly transforming into joyful triumph. She passed the telegram to Jackson, who read it with growing amazement. "The evidence you gathered before we fled, it was enough," he realized. "Your brother must have moved on it immediately after receiving our first message." Pearl nodded, hastily writing. "The documents I collected from the bank and land office during my first days in Red Creek. I sent copies to Benjamin with my regular reports, but didn't realize how damning they would be without additional testimony. Jackson laughed in relief, the tension of the past days finally breaking. So while we've been running for our lives through the wilderness, Blackwater was already being arrested in Denver. Pearl's smile was radiant as she wrote, "Justice sometimes works in unexpected ways." A more detailed letter arrived that afternoon from Benjamin, explaining that Pearl's meticulous documentation of Blackwater's land transactions had revealed a pattern of fraud that, when combined with existing evidence from other territories, had been sufficient to secure warrants. The attempted abduction of Pearl and the attack on the Haywards had only strengthened the case against him. "Your brother writes that the charges against me have been officially withdrawn," Jackson told Pearl after reading the letter. Apparently, being a federal agent's sister carries some weight with territorial authorities. Pearl smiled mischievously, writing, "Being a federal agent myself carries even more weight." Jackson stared at her in surprise. "You're an agent. Not just helping your brother." She nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and uncertainty as she wrote, unofficially, "Benjamin has been advocating for my formal appointment, arguing that my condition makes me uniquely valuable for certain investigations. People reveal more when they believe you cannot repeat their words." The revelation added a new dimension to his understanding of Pearl. Not just a brave woman helping her brother, but a professional in her own right, using what others perceived as a weakness as her greatest strength. "You continue to amaze me," Jackson said with genuine admiration. "Though I admit, a federal agent's life seems rather incompatible with what we discussed last night." Pearl's expression grew serious as she wrote, "That depends entirely on what you truly want, Jackson. I would never ask you to change your life for me." Jackson considered her words carefully. The past week had forced him to confront truths about himself he had long avoided, about what he truly valued and what he truly feared. "What I want," he said slowly, "is a life of meaning. For years, I convinced myself that meaning came from independence, from needing no one and answering to no one. But these days with you have shown me how empty that existence was." He took her hands in his, meeting her storm-gray eyes directly. "I don't know exactly what form our future might take, Pearl. But I know I want to build it with you, whether that means ranching, law enforcement, or something we haven't even considered yet." Her smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. She freed one hand to write, perhaps both. "The territory needs honest ranchers as much as it needs justice, and I find I'm rather tired of cities after years in Denver." The image formed in Jackson's mind, a ranch of their own, a place where Pearl could return from occasional investigative work, where they could build something lasting together. It was so different from the solitary future he had imagined for himself, yet it felt right in a way nothing had since his parents' death. "I like that vision," he said softly. "Very much." When Benjamin Whitaker arrived the following day, Jackson was struck by the family resemblance. Though male and several years older, Benjamin had the same storm-gray eyes and quiet dignity that characterized his sister. He embraced Pearl warmly before extending a hand to Jackson. "Mr. Caldwell, my sister's letters speak highly of your character and courage. It seems I owe you a debt of gratitude for keeping her safe." "She kept herself safe," Jackson replied honestly. "I merely provided navigation." Benjamin smiled, a knowing look passing between him and Pearl. "Nevertheless, your assistance proved invaluable. Had Blackwater's men succeeded in silencing her, our case might have collapsed despite the documentary evidence." Over the next hours, Benjamin briefed them on the developments in Denver. Blackwater had been arrested along with 2 territorial judges and several land office officials implicated in his schemes. The investigation was expanding to include the attacks on homesteaders like the Haywards, with several of Blackwater's hired guns already in custody. "And Thomas Hayward?" Jackson asked, remembering Sarah's vigil outside the doctor's office. "Recovering, according to our latest information," Benjamin assured him. Though his homestead is destroyed, the federal government will provide compensation to all those victimized by Blackwater's operations. It was welcome news, a justice more complete than Jackson had dared hope for. As the discussion continued, he observed the easy partnership between the Whitaker siblings, the respect Benjamin showed for Pearl's observations, the seamless way they communicated despite her silence. "We'll return to Red Creek tomorrow," Benjamin announced eventually. "There are still statements to be taken, evidence to be collected. The case must be airtight before it goes to trial." Pearl wrote something and passed it to her brother, who read it with raised eyebrows. "I see," he said, glancing between Pearl and Jackson. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Pearl." She shook her head firmly, writing again. Benjamin sighed, then addressed Jackson directly. "My sister informs me that her future plans may have changed somewhat as a result of recent events, specifically that she is considering a more permanent arrangement in the territory." His tone was carefully neutral, but his gaze was assessing. Jackson met that gaze steadily. "If you're asking my intentions toward your sister, Marshall Whitaker, they're honorable. I care for Pearl deeply and hope to build a future with her, with your blessing." Benjamin's expression softened slightly. "My sister makes her own decisions, Mr. Caldwell. She always has. I simply want to ensure those decisions are based on clear understanding of all factors." He turned to Pearl. "Have you told him everything?" Pearl's expression faltered momentarily. She shook her head. "Then perhaps you should," Benjamin suggested gently, "before plans advance further." Jackson looked between them in confusion. "Told me what?" Pearl hesitated, then reached for her notebook. Her pencil hovered over the page for a long moment before she began to write, more slowly and deliberately than usual. "My muteness is not entirely as I've presented it. While scarlet fever damaged my vocal cords in childhood, doctors believe I could speak with extensive therapy. I chose not to pursue treatment." Jackson read the words with growing confusion. "You chose to remain silent." "Why?" Pearl continued writing, her expression vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "After the fever, when I couldn't speak properly, I discovered something unexpected. People revealed truths around me they hid from others. My silence became a tool for understanding the world's hidden realities. Later, it became my strength in investigation." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding as she added, "I feared if you knew my silence was partly by choice, you might see it as deception." Jackson absorbed this revelation slowly, understanding its significance. Pearl had not merely adapted to a disability, she had transformed it into a powerful asset, one that shaped her identity and career. "Is this why you hesitated when we discussed the future?" he asked. "You thought I might feel misled." She nodded, relief evident in her expression at his calm response. Jackson took her hand, his decision already made. "Pearl, whether your silence comes from necessity or choice makes no difference to how I feel about you. I fell in love with who you are, your courage, your intelligence, your way of communicating that goes beyond words." The declaration of love had slipped out unplanned, but Jackson realized it was absolutely true. Sometime during their harrowing journey through the wilderness, admiration and attraction had deepened into something profound and unshakable. Pearl's eyes filled with tears. She wrote shakily, "I love you too, Jackson. I have since you saw me, truly saw me, when others looked past." Benjamin cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. His expression had softened considerably. "Well, it seems my concerns were unnecessary. Pearl has always chosen her own path wisely, Mr. Caldwell. It appears she's done so again." 2 days later, they returned to Red Creek as part of Benjamin's official delegation. The town had transformed in their absence, Blackwater's influence replaced by federal authority as agents investigated the full extent of his operations. Sheriff Mills had been arrested, along with several of Blackwater's hired guns, including Reeves. The citizens of Red Creek greeted Pearl and Jackson with a mixture of awe and apology. Many had believed Blackwater's claims about Jackson, while others had simply been too frightened to intervene. Pastor Mitchell welcomed them with open arms, having never doubted their integrity. In the weeks that followed, order was gradually restored to the region. Thomas Hayward recovered sufficiently to begin rebuilding his homestead with federal compensation and community support. Other victims of Blackwater's schemes saw justice and restitution as well. For Jackson and Pearl, the future came into clearer focus with each passing day. Using his savings and her federal stipend, they purchased a small ranch near Jenkins Valley, close enough to town for convenience, but with the privacy both had come to value. The property included excellent grazing land and a sturdy cabin that they immediately began expanding into a proper home. Pearl continued her work with the federal marshals on a consulting basis, her unique investigative skills too valuable to abandon completely. Jackson, finding unexpected satisfaction in settled life, focused on building their ranch while occasionally assisting Benjamin with local cases that benefited from his knowledge of the territory. 6 months after their flight through the wilderness, on a perfect autumn day with the aspens glowing gold against the mountains, Jackson and Pearl were married in Pastor Mitchell's church. The small ceremony was attended by Benjamin, the Haywards, and the handful of townspeople who had become true friends. Pearl chose to remain silent during the ceremony, communicating her vows through written words that Jackson read aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. But at the conclusion, when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, she surprised everyone, most of all Jackson. "I do," she whispered, the words rusty from disuse but perfectly clear in the hushed church. Jackson stared at her in wonder, tears forming in his eyes as he realized the gift she had given him, breaking her chosen silence to speak the 2 words that mattered most. Later that evening, alone in their home, Pearl explained through both writing and halting speech that she had been practicing secretly with a doctor in Denver during her visits. Some things, she managed to say, her voice soft but determined, deserved to be spoken aloud. Jackson held her close, overwhelmed by love for this remarkable woman. "Spoken or unspoken, I hear you perfectly," he assured her. "I always will." As they stood together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple, Jackson reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had believed for 12 years that isolation was the only safe path in the harsh reality of the frontier, that trust and love were luxuries he couldn't afford. Pearl had proven him wrong, showing him that true strength came not from standing alone, but from finding someone worth standing beside. Her silence had spoken volumes, teaching him to listen with more than his ears, to hear with his heart. "What are you thinking?" Pearl asked, her newly practiced voice still tentative but growing stronger with each day. Jackson smiled, drawing her closer as the first stars appeared above the mountains they now called home. "That sometimes the most important truths require no words at all." Pearl's answering smile confirmed the wisdom they had both discovered on their unlikely journey from solitude to partnership, that in a land of harsh realities and constant challenges, love might be the greatest act of courage and the surest path to truly being heard.